Martin Luther King Jr. Probably a name you've heard before. Maybe you know him from the I Have a Dream speech or the leader of the Civil Rights Movement. Well, let's start from the beginning. Segregation was rising very fast, with almost everything being segregated, from water fountains, restaurants, schools, and almost anything they would. White supremacy was on the rise. In the 1920s, there were almost 4 million KKK members. The KKK had lots of members with power, like cops, parts of the court, governors, and more. White supremacy was taught in schools and said to be in the Bible, in which almost everyone was Christian. While the number of KKK members dropped, that doesn't mean people stopped being racist. Attacks on black neighborhoods, schools, and people in general were still being carried out very frequently. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression hit. The stock market crashed, losing billions of dollars and wiping out millions of investors. With billions of lost dollars, companies had to close, making it even harder to find a job if you were African American. In the 1930s, about only 50% of African Americans had jobs, making it much harder for African Americans to find jobs. Hate crimes and killings on black people rose from 8 lynchings in 1932 and 28 in 1933. In 1931, the Dust Bowls hit Georgia hard. It ravaged crops and tore them up. Already suffering from boll weevil, people were devastated. With almost 70% of people living in rural areas, a lot of them had to move to cities to find jobs. Martin Luther King's father, James Albert King, were sharecroppers. They worked hard and made little pay. When he left at 16 with clothes and shoes and a sixth grade education, he left Atlanta to find a job and a future. He worked many jobs, but was known as a preacher at 2 churches in Atlanta. While working in church, he met Alberta Christine Williams, whom he married and had 3 children. Alberta Christine Williams had just come home from college to become a schoolteacher and was in Atlanta looking for a job. After being married, they moved to the center of Atlanta's African American business district. When Alberta Christine Williams' father asked James King to become a priest at the church, he accepted, and when the leader of the church died, he became the head of the church. King was born into a financially stable family alongside his siblings, where he taught Christianity and went to a good school. James King was a strong figure in the NAACP, where he led a protest for equal pay between whites and blacks. James King had a big impact on Martin's life of protest and equal rights. As Martin Luther King was growing up, he was discriminated against a lot. As a young boy, he couldn't play with certain people and would have to stand in the bus for white people to sit. Martin Luther King's family encouraged him to look at every injustice and would take note on it. One major push to his protests were the loss of his brother. Martin Luther King would graduate from high school at 15 and went to Morris House College, where he studied many topics. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks would be arrested for sitting in the front of the bus. From her protest, she started a movement, and no one rode the bus for 381 days. Martin Luther King was chosen as the official spokesman, where then he would become the official spokesman of the Civil Rights Movement. As became the spokesman, he talked about how they needed to use peace to solve this discrimination. With violence, they would only spark more hate and probably lead to more problems. As a result of the bus boycott, all buses were unsegregated, and it brought lots of attention to the protests, as well as showing how they had power. It gives hope to the people that they can change things. After the bus boycott, Martin Luther King gained lots of popularity, both positive and negative. After the bus boycott, Martin Luther King was arrested for starting a boycott on the Montgomery City streets and was faced with $500 bail or 386 days in prison. On January 30th, 1956, his house was bombed. When the word got out, people were angry and wanted revenge. They eventually calmed down, knowing retaliation was not the way to solve this attack. In 1956, Martin Luther King creates the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, known as the SCLC. It was a campaign to fight segregation and achieve civil rights. On May 17, 1957, King speaks to a crowd of 1,500 people in Washington, D.C. about civil rights. As the outcome of his speech, Congress passed the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction. Martin Luther King published his first book in 1958 called A Strides Towards Freedom. During a book signing on September 20th, Martin Luther King was stabbed along with other civil rights leaders there. Martin Luther King would be taken to a hospital and be okay. On June 23, 1958, Martin Luther King meets with President Eisenhower to discuss problems affecting African Americans. In 1959, Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King traveled to India as Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru guest to study Gandhi's philosophies. Martin Luther King liked Gandhi's way of no violence and would try his best to formulate his teachings. On November 29th, Martin Luther King resigns from his job as a church priest to pursue his work on the civil rights and grow the SCLC. In 1960, Martin Luther King moves to Atlanta to continue his civil rights work. Martin Luther King starts a new protest called the Sit-In, where they walk into white-only sit-in restaurants and they still until they are served. One day on a sit-in, Martin Luther King is arrested and sentenced to 4 months in jail when President Kennedy stops in MLK and releases him. In 1961, after all transportation was made desegregated, Martin Luther King brings lots of people, all races, to join the Freedom Ride around the South. On May 21st, Martin Luther King announces a mass rally combined with other freedom fighters to help for civil rights. Later that year, Martin Luther King travels to Montgomery, Alabama to start a mass protest. About 700 people show and march on the streets. Martin Luther King was arrested for not having a permit to parade down the streets. The following year, in 1962, Martin Luther King is tried for leading the march in the previous year. On July 27th, Martin Luther King is arrested again for holding a prayer vigil in Albany and is thrown in jail. Martin Luther King leaves jail. He leaves jail on August 10th on an agree to stop protesting there. In 1963, sit-down demonstrations hit Birmingham, Alabama, and on April 12th, Martin Luther King and Ralph Albathy get arrested for protesting without a permit. While they're in jail, Martin Luther King writes his famous letter from Birmingham jail. On April 19th, Martin Luther King and Ralph are released on bond. On May 2nd, the Children's Crusade, or the Children's Civil Rights Movement, went along when the police showed up and used fire hoses to spray and dogs. Most of the high school students that participated were jailed. Soon that year, the bill of the Birmingham Agreement was signed, desegregating schools, jobs, restaurants, and stores. This new law brought segregation to a bomb the Gaston Motel, where MLK was staying. 1963 was the end of segregation in the South. On June 11th, JFK was able to say segregation was illegal in all states and sign a new civil rights bill. On June 23rd, Martin Luther King leads 125,000 people on a freedom walk, and in March he leads a march for open jobs and freedom and segregation. This march was the largest march in history, with almost 250,000 people joining. On September 15th, 1963, a dynamite bomb kills 4 African American girls attending a Sunday school. After the attack, Martin Luther King delivers the eulog for the 4 girls, and on September 22nd, John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. In 1964, Martin Luther King is represented as the Man of the Year on the New York Times. Martin Luther King was then arrested once more for integration of the public combinations. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Schwerner were found missing after they tried to register black voters. These names might sound familiar, maybe from the movie Mississippi Burning that I watched this semester. Martin Luther King was able to join the signing ceremony of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. After this, Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and at the end was the youngest to receive it. On February 2nd, 1965, Martin Luther King is arrested again for voting rights in Alabama. When they crossed the Pettus Bridge, police start beating the protesters. This day would be known as the Bloody Sunday after 17 marchers were hospitalized and 50 treated for other injuries. Alabama at the time was the threshold of the Confederacy, and on August 6, Martin Luther King signed the voting rights alongside President Johnson. On January 22, 1966, Martin Luther King moves to Chicago to get to the poor communities, but would go back to Alabama to elect new black officials since the equal voting rights. On June 6, James Meredith is shot on the March for Fear. Later that year, Martin Luther King leads a protest through a crowd and gets rocks thrown at him by racist white people. On April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King gives his first speech about anti-war. On April 15th, in front of the United Nations building, he gave a speech about Vietnam, which leads to be the biggest peace protest in the country. The Supreme Court holds Martin Luther King accountable for leading the protest on the streets without a permit, which puts him in jail for 4 days. In March 1968, Martin Luther King agrees to lead a march through open housing and equal rights. After the protests turn violent, he tries to calm everyone down but fails. He vouched to march with them once more once they behave themselves. Evening, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated by James Earl Ray on the balcony of his motel. His death caused many riots and will lead to 220,000 arrests. Martin Luther King's casket would be followed by 50,000 people in sad for Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's legacy still remains today, and his attempts at freedom have come a long way. We are getting one step closer to Martin Luther King's dream every day, and we can still push and fight for true equal rights.